York ain't New York anymore. How I miss those old pals of mine. The sawdust is gone from the floor where we harmonize Sweet Adeline. On the east side, west side, things ain't like before. There are tears in the eyes of the regular guys. Oh, New York ain't New York anymore.
Hello, history lovers, and welcome. I'm your host, Dean Karayanis, and this is the History Author Show on iHeartRadio. In this episode, we welcome a familiar passenger back into the time machine. He's Dr. Paul Kahan, who we last chatted with about his book, Amiable Scoundrel, Simon Cameron, Lincoln's Scandalous Secretary of War. Prior to that, he really gave us our money's worth with The Bank War, Andrew Jackson, Nicholas Biddle, and the fight for American finance. You can catch those conversations at historyauthor.com or wherever you're listening now. And we had something a little extra for the Bank War. You can enjoy the video that we produced illustrating the political cartoons and all of the journalistic changes that were occurring around the time Andrew Jackson took on the United States National Bank. You can watch that on our Facebook page, or I'll go ahead and link it from this episode's page at historyauthor.com. If you've ever wanted to see Andrew Jackson strangle somebody with the belt of his bathrobe, Paul's book is the right place. Paul Kahan holds a PhD in U.S. History from Temple University, an MA in Modern American History and Literature, and BAs in History and English. You can learn more about him at paulkahan.com or follow him on Twitter at Paul_Kahan. That last name is spelled Kahan. Paul joins us in this episode to discuss his latest work, The Presidency of Ulysses S. Grant, Preserving the Civil War's Legacy. Regular listeners will know that I've read at least one bio on each U.S. president, and that I've not only tried to find something that's praiseworthy about each of them, but I'm not a fan of those lists that rank the commanders-in-chief like college football teams, especially since there's no playoffs. The evolution of Grant's reputation in the eyes of historians bears out the method of my presidential madness. The general has long been relegated to a very low spot in those polls, a much maligned figure in the Oval Office, as one historian put it, because his enemies were better writers than his friends. It's worth noting who those enemies were, by the way: defeated Confederates and unreconstructed Southern Democrats who had a lot of time to sit around, steam, and write rehabilitations of their lost cause. Well, with a century and a half of scholarship, and everybody who had a personal grudge with Grant long since gone, it's good to see one of the genuinely nicest men ever to reach the White House getting a fresh and fairer look. Now that we've reached the 1870s, let's step out of our time machine with Dr. Paul Kahan and examine the Presidency of Ulysses S. Grant. I'm joined on the line by Paul Kahan, author of The Presidency of Ulysses S. Grant, Preserving the Civil War's Legacy. Welcome back to the History Author Show, Paul.
Thank you very much. I'm so glad to be here again.
Well, I'm glad whenever I get an email from you and you say, I have a new book. So I appreciate you making the time a third time to come on and speak with me about this book, and that you chose somebody who has a special place in my heart as a historian, somebody who loves presidential museums, somebody who loves reading bios, somebody who likes to pick up those little pieces of what we call trivia, but were real things in their lives, real events, stories. Lincoln, of course, was a great storyteller, loved to tell them, to illustrate things. And Grant is one of those people who didn't talk about himself a lot, didn't get to write memoirs of his presidency. He did write it about his Civil War service, But he has many strikes against him, many negative strikes, one of which is the worst that I guess you could imagine as a biographer, and that's that he apologized for his 2 terms in office. So right away as a historian, he's saying, well, it's hard for me to give a fair picture of you if you're going to start right off the bat and say, oh my gosh, I'm really sorry about that. Warren G. Harding, I'm not fit for this office and should never have been here when he was president. It's like, well, that's not going to get you a lot of historians saying, hey, I want to look into this guy, especially when we already know that what you did in the Civil War. We could just leave it at that. How did you go about making the case in the presidency of Ulysses S. Grant to dispel the misjudgments about him of previous biographies and histories? I know you wanted to give a fair picture. This isn't as if you're putting him on trial and you're acting as Ulysses S. Grant's defense attorney, but you wanted to find an accurate picture and do it in something that's a quick read. You have an organized read. I can imagine somebody in the old days before we had smartphones, I would have left a copy of the Presidency of Ulysses S. Grant in the back of my pickup truck, and I would have, when I was waiting, I would have said, let me read a chapter here, a chapter there. So how did you confront that and go about trying to find a fair picture when he right off the bat started you off saying, I wasn't a great president?
That's a really great question, and I think it really gets to the heart of what we as historians do. I mean, how do you get past someone's own self-assessment, particularly when there's more than a century and a half of literature that basically says, boy, that was the only thing he got right about it. And it is kind of interesting. I think that Grant sells his presidency short in a lot of ways. As you mentioned in his memoirs, he doesn't talk about the presidency. He ends in 1865, and it's as if he didn't live another 20 years, 8 of them as president, travel the world, make a fortune, lose a fortune, live this really full and interesting and controversial and impactful life. And what sparked my interest in Grant's presidency is when I was writing my previous book, Amiable Scoundrel, about Simon Cameron. Cameron returned to the Senate in 1867, and his last tenure in the Senate from 1867 to 1877 overlapped almost exactly with Grant's 2 terms as president. And Cameron played a leading role in shepherding various aspects of Grant's legislative goals through the Senate. And when I was writing that book, what I really wanted was a good, slim volume that dealt with Grant's presidency, put it in context, sort of discussed the key players, but also discussed the relationship between the Senate and the presidency, the House of Representatives and the presidency, and nothing existed. There were plenty of fantastic biographies, but they all had the same defect, which is they spend hundreds upon hundreds of pages talking about the war and relatively little space talking about the presidency. Because again, historians have taken Grant at his word that his presidency was just a series of mistakes. As Grant would say, I've made mistakes as all can see and as I'm willing to admit. But he quickly follows that up with, the mistakes have been mistakes not of intention, that these weren't things that I set out to do. They were mistakes of judgment, or they were mistakes of a novice rather than being based on evil or based on malfeasance. And I think that's a really important starting point, that Grant set out to do the best that he could, and that there were several limitations as a person, with an institution at his particular moment in history that really sort of conspired, I think, to make his presidency what it was.
As you're speaking about Grant, I'm thinking of David Petruccia. And when I interviewed him about TR's last war, he said those last years of Theodore Roosevelt's life, where he's confronting the Great War, his sons all go off to fight in the war. Honestly, he's already had the presidency. He's had all the stuff in Cuba. He's been a police commissioner in New York City, one of 4. So there's lots of chances for strife there. There's no number one guy. He has that great childhood, mornings on horseback. He has the tragedy of losing his first wife. There's so much that he said by the time you get to those last few years of his life, the guy's exhausted you as a biographer.
Mm-hmm.
So usually it's just, well, the Great War came along and then he died right after he lost his son, Quentin, which was tragic. His golden lad, that was his favorite. And you just move on. That makes me think of Grant. If you're a writer, if you're a historian, and you get his giant book of his memoirs that are so well written, that are the gold standard, dropped on your desk. You have something as sweeping as the Civil War. and something that's as clear cut for a narrative, well, you're going to focus on that. And you're not going to want to get into the messy Reconstruction and, well, there's a bunch of factions of the various parties and legislation. It just, your eyes glaze over a little bit. And frankly, it's not going to sell the book, which is the goal. You're going to put all this effort into a book and then have people look at it and say, gosh, this is too much for me. Whereas what you've done here in the Presidency of Ulysses S. Grant, if it was me, if I just picked this book up, as I said, I had it in the back of that pickup truck, I'm sure I would have been giving somebody a ride and they would have said, well, that Grant, huh? He's pretty much just a drunk, right? And I would have said, well, you take this copy of the book and I'm going to throw you out of my truck while you're walking to the bus. You can read it and learn about the real Grant. And then I would buy another copy of your book. And your book is something where you really can do that. And if you care about history, you want to do what I did and read a biography of each president that's going to illustrate them. You pick up this book and you say, here's a guy who reminds me of somebody. No interest in partisan politics, took the job because the office called him, not because he was pining for the office. He had successes on the battlefield and he, like Eisenhower, wanted to secure them. And so that's how we'd all like to be judged. We like to be judged on the job we did, even if he's self-deprecating there. He wanted to go and do the job, but at first he's not fit for it. And he's facing this huge panic of 1873, which doesn't have as catchy a name as the Great Depression, but it was very, very serious at the time. There's a lot going on here in the presidency of Ulysses S. Grant. His leadership style, just like Eisenhower's, just like Zachary Taylor's before him, his mentor, I guess you'd say, Grant's, he doesn't have that ability. You can't go and shoot Congress, right? You can't throw them in the stockade as much as you might have liked to.
There are times Grant thought about it, no doubt.
So that's part of the thing here, is that doesn't translate. So how much does, when say he's confronting an economic panic, or when he's confronting the legacy of Reconstruction, how much is the fact that being a president and commander-in-chief is not the same as being a general play into how Grant leads the nation through those crises?
Well, and I think that's a really good point. And I think that the specific political context of Reconstruction is incredibly important to Grant's story. Grant assumes the presidency within a year and a half of Congress impeaching for the first time the President of the United States and allowing that individual, Andrew Johnson, to keep his office basically at Congress's sufferance. It's an incredibly heady moment for Congress that's reasserting, that's changing the balance between the executive and the legislative branch. It's not entirely clear what the outcome of that's going to be. It's not entirely clear whether or not the Republican Party is going to survive the war. It's not entirely clear what the future is politically is going to look like, whether you're going to have these forces that sort of reassert themselves and we're going to go back to Whigs and Democrats, or if we're going to build a new political environment around a revitalized Republican Party. And so Grant is sort of navigating these things. And as Sherman says to him when he runs for president, he said, a great general might be a baby politician. And in fact, Grant was a baby politician in a lot of ways. But, as I say when I talk about this book, Abraham Lincoln has supremely good timing. He wins the war and then manages to catch a nasty case of death without having to deal with. I know, I say this, and I was at a talk a few weeks ago and everyone gasped. And I said, oh, too soon? He doesn't have to deal with the really sticky issues about what reconstructing the country looks like. What does the future of the United States look like? What does the end of slavery mean? Lincoln sort of shuffles off the scene before really having to deal with those. And those are messy questions that don't lend themselves to easy answers. And I think that there's a lack of moral clarity in those struggles when compared to something like the war. I think it's Grant's, on one hand, bad luck to be president during that moment, but on some level, that's what he asked for. He wanted to be president in that moment to consolidate and protect what he had won on the battlefield. And so it's almost as if the conditions were conspiring against him.
That's that line, that thing in the popular mind, especially about those presidents that people don't know as well as a Theodore Roosevelt or a Lincoln. people think he was an alcoholic. People say it very casually. That wasn't so far off the mark, right? If someone saw a book on Grant that I was reading, they would ask that. I mentioned Chester A. Arthur. I remember sitting under the portrait of him that hangs in McSorley's Old Ale House in New York City, the city's oldest bar. And there's a lot of memorabilia in there. They were around during the Civil War. They were actually the headquarters for the Fighting 69th, the Irish Brigade, when they were putting down the draft riots there. So we're looking at the memorabilia, and somebody saw a picture of Grant, and they said, well, so he was an alcoholic, huh? He was just a big drunk. And my response, having had a few ales at McSorley's there myself, was completely sincerely, I said, no, he wasn't an alcoholic. He was a binge drinker like us. I was a young man that was completely sincere what I said about him, and I thought that was pretty fair, but I only got laughs. I didn't get any knowing nods. There was unfortunately no veterans of the Grand Army of the Republic there to back me up. So help me out here, Paul. Was I onto something there? What will readers learn in the presidency of Ulysses S. Grant to put the stories of his drinking in perspective, especially not just during his time in the service, his time alone in remote outposts, but while he's in the White House? Is it a problem for him in the White House?
No, it isn't. And the two most prominent instances where he gets drunk are periods when he's got a lot of time on his hands and Julia isn't around. Grant is not an alcoholic in the way that we think of alcoholics. He doesn't have a problem continuously. Where he ends up facing problems is when he has a lot of time on his hands and Julia isn't around. And so when after the Mexican-American War, when he's stationed in Humboldt, California, and the thing to do is get drunk because you're in this remote middle of nowhere fort, that's when he has a problem with alcohol. Another time that he has a problem with alcohol is when he's on Andrew Johnson's Swing Around the Circle, and he's basically being used as a prop by Johnson to cement Johnson's electoral control over Congress. And again, Julia is not around. During the war, he doesn't have a problem with drink, and during his presidency, Julia lives in the White House with him. And there is no evidence that alcohol is a problem. He was a very devoted family man, particularly devoted to his wife, and he got very, very lonely when she wasn't around. And it's amazing to see their interaction. The small amount of correspondence that we have between the two of them demonstrates the profound depth of his love for her. Their relationship is really one of the most beautiful relationships between anyone that I've ever written about. And so it's when she's not around that you have to worry, when he has a lot of time on his hands. So the myth of him being this raging alcoholic is really a construction of his political enemies. They talk about him when he's a general and they want his position. They talk about him when he's in the White House and they wish that he wasn't in the White House. But his reputation for alcoholism is way overblown.
I always note to people, and I say always because whenever I hear this, of course, the person gets an earful about Grant. I say he was a small guy. He's 5'8", and at the time that he's in the Army, he's not as if he's 200 pounds even or anything. He's a small guy. And when we look at a president or a general, it's fun to look down on them and poke them with the rhetorical stick. Everyone doesn't have the same tolerance for alcohol. Mm-hmm. And for him, he would have one beer and it would be off to the races. Some people are just like that.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, he was a reasonably small guy. He had a very low tolerance, again, because he wasn't a habitual drinker. This was not a guy who was used to putting away 2 bottles of wine at a sitting. It just so happens that the moments where he has these binge outbreaks are particularly well documented. But once you get past those events, you don't really see additional evidence of an alcohol problem. And it's certainly not a problem during the White House. I mean, the man basically lives in a fishbowl for 8 years while he's in the White House. And there's no evidence that he was a drinker to excess while he was president.
And somebody certainly would have made it up if they had to, if there was an opportunity.
Absolutely. I mean, this was not a period where people were overly scrupulous about the truth about their political enemies, no doubt.
Thank goodness we're over that as a nation.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. No fake news these days.
Well, he also was a guy that loved his wife. You mentioned Julia a couple of times. They talk about them holding hands in their old age. And I would challenge anyone who questions his drinking or thinks he was weak, to go read some of those letters that he writes to her. And I say that he writes to her because he writes 10, 15, 20 letters to her by the end of the correspondence, begging her, please write me back. And partly because of her vision, which is why you only see her in profile, she had a difficult time writing a letter. You know, she had double vision and she had a hard time of it, but it's clear the longing, and it's heartbreaking. And so, all right, the guy's going to self-medicate, to use another modern term. We have to realize they are people. And I think that's why I take up for the guy a little and say, let's look at it within the context of the time. If you or I were separated from our wives for a long period of time, just going and having a drink wouldn't be a big deal for us. For Ulysses S. Grant, following that one drink with a second and a third, he'd be on the floor. And that's just a physical limitation that the guy had, partially. And he eventually, as you said, when he's in the White House, he stayed away from it.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's interesting in going back to their relationship. I mean, her memoir, which wasn't published until the late 1970s, is just brimming with the sort of warmth of their relationship. I mean, it was very clear that it was reciprocal. And it's unfortunate that his papers weren't published until beginning the 1960s. We didn't get the presidential papers until the mid 1990s, and her memoirs weren't published until the late 1970s. So what it created was a vacuum where their perspective really wasn't easily accessible by the general public or by scholars. And so reconstructions of this era were typically taken from their political enemies. And as a result, you got a very negative view of them as people, Grant as president, etc. And it's a real challenge for historians reconstructing the past when your sources are somewhat limited. It's something that I faced writing my biography of Simon Cameron, because reconstructing his relationship with his wife was incredibly difficult because she was with him almost all the time. And so there was no need for them to write letters back and forth. He could just get up and go across the room and say whatever he wanted to say to her. The few letters that we do have demonstrate a very loving and companionate marriage, which sort of runs counter to his view as this sort of depraved scoundrel. It's one of those challenges when you write a biography, or, in the case of the presidency of Ulysses S. Grant, a sort of in-depth focus of a particular period in someone's life. You're left with the sources that you have, and sometimes they're not as loquacious as you might want them to be.
That's why everybody who's a historian of early America thanks God for the Adamses, because they wrote everything, including about themselves. If I was back then, I would say, hey, don't mess with the Adams family. They're going to write about you and say what they think. They're watching everything. So everybody goes to those. A lot of the other founding fathers, they burned their papers, or they didn't want their personal letters seen. They didn't think their childhood mattered. So that's a treasure trove of things that you can go back to. Whereas here, if people thought that you misspoke, you did mean the 1990s. So think of that. That's over a century of scholarship. Whereas I heard it put once, Grant's enemies were better writers than his friends, certainly more prolific. So he never gets that look because it's going and asking somebody who hates the person. If you're going to write a biography, say, on George Steinbrenner, you go get a real diehard Red Sox fan and you say, well, tell me about this guy. You're not going to get him warts and all. You're going to get him all warts.
Yeah, absolutely. And, it's one of the things, too, I think that we tend to forget in an era of the internet and the accessibility of information and Google Books. 20 years ago, you didn't have those things, and you were limited by what was generally available. You were limited by what you could get through interlibrary loan. You were limited by what had been cited in previous books. And so what you get is the unintentional creation of an echo chamber where certain sources become the most widely cited sources, and they tended to be the sources that were most aggressively anti-Grant. And I think that it's no surprise that as his papers have been published in these sort of large, authoritative, scholarly versions, and the internet has made possible keyword searches of long forgotten books and made them accessible, that we're starting to get a more nuanced and more balanced historical impression of figures like Grant. Certainly, I don't think that I could have written my biography of Simon Cameron or the presidency of Ulysses S. Grant as well if I hadn't had access to those sources.
It's great to read new stuff in there too. As I said, I read a long biography of Grant, And yet I still can learn new things. And that's because you, as a historian, are adding new things to the historical record and putting them in a book. Whereas if you do just keep retelling the same stories, which often happens with figures, you're never going to the primary source because they don't exist. In this case, they just existed, they just were unknown. So we never had that chance to go find new things about them.
Yeah, I totally agree. And it's kind of these nerdy historian, sort of nitty gritty questions about how you approach your subject. And, right now I'm working on a biography of James Buchanan. And one of the big things that I've been trying to do is track down these various different collections all over the United States, which I'm aware of because they're listed in WorldCat and are therefore accessible to me in a way that they wouldn't have been and that I wouldn't have been aware of 25 or 30 years ago. The last great biography of Buchanan is more than 50 years old. And when that book was written, you couldn't Google James Buchanan papers and, oh, here's a teeny tiny little collection that's in California. Let me call them up and get them to send me scans of it, and here we go. So technology is definitely changing the way in which historians do what they do. I hope that it's making for a richer, more nuanced, and more complicated picture of these figures. And in the case of the presidency of Ulysses S. Grant, that's definitely the case.
So enjoyable to read that new stuff. Even if you're not a history nerd, if you're just a person that never picked up a book before on any president, and you pick up one on Grant because you drive down the West Side Highway in Manhattan a lot, let's say, and see his tomb and wonder who he is, you're going to get such a fuller and more enjoyable read because those things flesh them out. We can always tell as a reader, even if we're not thinking consciously, your brain is aware that the person's filling it in, or, oh yeah, I've heard that before somewhere else. And it's like the director's cut now. You pick up the presidency of Ulysses S. Grant and you say, hey, here's a period that maybe was only covered in a line or two in my high school textbook or in another biography that I read or a Civil War book that I read. And then you can enjoy the fact that the guy's legacy comes back all the time, that we do see him in street names and we do hear him talked about, and we hear about the pain of Reconstruction to this day. For instance, West Point just erected a statue to the 18th president. So that's a brand new thing. He's still alive and relevant, especially at a time when we're reassessing statues and tearing down many historical figures that were being put up not during the war, but 20 years later, when the history of the war is being rewritten. Grant is being cast as a villain in the history books now that he's not around to defend himself anymore. And we're starting to put up signs that the South shall rise again, for lack of a better phrase, and rewriting it, making it cleaner in the eyes of people who want to revise it. We talked about that with Dr. Joan E. Cashin of Ohio State University about her book War Stuff. Everyone was very honest right after the war. In fact, Grant says that the southern states, the Confederacy, were on their knees, willing to do anything for us. But then Johnson decided he wanted to turn them into a political force. And now they're starting to say, well, wait a minute, we didn't lose. You just butchered us and were cruel to us. So I love that we'll be able to get those things out of the way and find that clear view, even though we may have picked up some negative things. One of the things that is a black mark, General Order 11, excluding Jewish people from the camp at the time and from doing trading in the South. He felt they were coming there and taking advantage of people. That's something in the presidency of Ulysses S. Grant. As I said, you can go right to that chapter and get it and find out the truth. Grant says, quote, "It would never have been issued if it had not been telegraphed the moment it was penned and without reflection." And I thought, man, that sounds like the very first Twitter blunder, doesn't it? Like,
Well, it's interesting. It's funny. I was actually having a conversation with another historian who has a very different perspective about the past than I do, but is constantly provoking me to think about these things differently. And he mentioned the role and the importance of technological change to the Jacksonian moment and the introduction of telegraphs and newspapers and sort of monopolization of information. And these new technologies really impact very heavily the political scene. And we're living through a moment in our history right now where the internet is profoundly reshaping our communication ability, and therefore the way we interact with people and the ways in which political identities are shaped. And Grant, was a young man while those changes were reshaping the political landscape of the United States. And, you're absolutely right. In Franklin's day, Franklin talks about how he would write a letter in the mid 18th century and then leave it overnight and then come back to it and decide whether or not to send it. And more often than not, he didn't. But you wonder if, Franklin could have just dashed it off and run down to the telegraph office in a heat of rage and just sent it out, how different his legacy would be. And I think that's the case with Grant, not to excuse what Grant does. General Order 11 is awful. And Grant's apology is on some level a non-apology apology. What he's apologizing for is having said the thing rather than reflecting on it, not that he had thought it in the first place. And it does come back to bite him. And I think the jury is still out on the degree to which anti-Semitism is a legitimate aspect of Grant's personality, because of course, as president, as I make clear in the chapter on Grant's first term foreign policy, he does express some sympathy for the plight of European Jews. At the same time, this is a man who makes no bones about his utter disdain for Mormons, who at this time are practicing polygamy. So it's not that Grant doesn't have bigoted attitudes. It's that I think you have very few data points when it comes to his attitude toward Jews. And as a result, I think historians' reaction to that telegraph and the way that we interpret it tells us a lot about us as individuals as much as it does about Grant as a historical figure, if that makes sense.
Yeah, because I'm thinking that apology is exactly what you're saying, where it's, well, I'm sorry I hit send, or that's not me, people say, right? That wasn't me. It was somebody else inhabited my body.
Right.
Like the sitcom, I think it was one season, Jennifer Slept Here. I bet nobody remembers that sitcom, but it, it was a sitcom where there was a old actress that haunted this house, and in one episode she's able to go and inhabit people's bodies. She goes into a major league ball player and he strikes out because she's a ghost. But then again, as you said, it's only one data point. So it's painful to look at it and have to accept that we just don't know. So which side do we come down on? What do we say about that one thing that he did? We just have to condemn that act and then say, well, we don't see a longer paper trail that we would like to see from somebody. Whereas if you look at somebody like Andrew Johnson or James K. Polk, it's pretty straightforward what their bigoted attitudes were, and we know what they are. So it's just something where it's more fleshed out, I guess maybe you'd say.
Yeah, and it's again, it's something that I'm struggling with Buchanan, because Buchanan has very progressive attitudes toward Roman Catholicism, while at the same time having these utterly retrograde attitudes toward Mormons. Ends up as president sending an army into Utah basically to force the Mormons to conform to his particular vision of sexual morality. I think people are complicated individuals. I think it's sometimes hard to understand their motives on their own terms. At the same time, I don't buy into this idea that because they lived 150 years ago, that somehow puts them beyond reproach. I think Grant's order is distasteful, and I think that it's important to struggle with that when you're writing about his presidency. And so, I sort of balance it with saying, this is where he is in the mid 1860s. When he gets to the presidency, by the same token, he's expressing a great deal of sympathy for European Jews. And so, what do we make of that? And people are sometimes contradictory and hold these, what on the surface look like clashing ideas. And that's just, the nature of humanity. But by the same token, the book isn't just about Grant. It's about an administration, which, as I hope comes across in the book, is more than just the president speaks and it happens. You've got cabinet ministers who, to a greater or lesser degree, think of themselves as independent of the president. You have a newly assertive Congress that, wants to pursue its prerogatives. You've got a Supreme Court that's sort of trying to find its role in all of this. And you've got the people on the ground implementing these policies, interpreting and implementing them in ways that are different than what I think Grant would have intended. And I think that we tend to recount history from the White House as if there's no intermediate steps between what the president intends and what actually happens. But as the book makes clear, there are a lot of ways in which it's almost like whisper down the lane. You start with one message, and by the time you get all around the basement floor, it's a totally different message.
You're enjoying my conversation with Dr. Paul Kahan, author of a book you can tell I'm very passionate about, and a subject, the presidency in general and Ulysses S. Grant in particular, that I'm really enjoying. The book is The Presidency of Ulysses S. Grant, Preserving the Civil War's Legacy. You can find our guest at paulkahan.com or follow him at Paul_Kahan on Twitter. Stephen Puleo, author of American Treasures, The Caning, and Dark Tide, writes of the book, "The conventional wisdom is that Grant was a brilliant general and, at best, a mediocre president." Paul Kahan's book should change your thinking. His Grant is flawed, yes, but someone who, at his core, believed in and fought for the principles of equality and justice. Paul, that idea of the conventional wisdom about Grant is something that I'm sure you could tell and listeners can tell gets under my skin, and I'm willing to go after those things and try to correct the historical record. I've heard that so many times about Grant, just like the drinking. In fact, I was at the Grant statue with my wife that stands in the shadow of Capitol Hill, and a woman was telling her friend exactly that about Grant. It could have been word for word from your blurb what that conventional wisdom is, that he just wasn't a good president. But those words equality and justice are not to be glossed over, nor are the words on his tomb in Manhattan that say, "Let us have peace." Those are powerful, and he does his best to make that peace stick, to make it a lasting peace. In The Presidency of Ulysses S. Grant, you discuss his efforts to root out the Ku Klux Klan. Of all the misconceptions about Grant, say a word for us on this one that sometimes finds him listed alongside slaveholding presidents as if he had this massive plantation simply because his father-in-law decided to leave him a human being in his will. It always seems, as what you just said there, it's easy to cast somebody on a list and just stick him over there with the bigots. And so shine a little bit of light on that. Where does he come down on the question of the KKK and of the freedmen?
Sure. So that's a fantastic question, and I think it really gets to the heart of a lot of the debates that we're having today. I mean, Grant's legacy is bound up with almost entirely how we remember Reconstruction. And as the generation that fought the Civil War aged, and we come to the end of the 19th century, there was this desire to make the war sort of this grand, glorious, noble endeavor, and the sort of messy political side, the causes of the war aside. And so it becomes this struggle where there are no bad guys. And what was it really about? It doesn't really matter. Everybody who served valorously. And you can see it, there's this fantastic footage of the 50th anniversary of Gettysburg where these little old Union veterans and these little old Confederate veterans are running at each other. And when they get to the middle of the field, they actually embrace. And there's no room for that interpretation for slavery, which is unquestionably a moral evil. Well, the problem with Reconstruction is the central question of Reconstruction is, what is the future of African Americans? Now that we have freed African Americans, now that we have abolished slavery, what does that actually mean? Does that mean that they're going to be politically equal to white men? Does it mean that they're going to be socially and culturally equal to white men? How far is the government, whether state government or federal government, going to go to ensure that their rights are protected? And those are very sticky and profoundly threatening questions. And there's really no room in this sort of lost cause, there were no bad guys narrative for that. In addition, there's this undercurrent in pop culture through things like Birth of a Nation or Gone with the Wind that talk about how Reconstruction was this misguided effort to impose these rules on Southern society and really, put Southern white women at the mercy of rapacious, beast-like African Americans. And it's really profoundly disturbing and disgusting. And so if Reconstruction is cast as this haywire experiment that's gone too far, well, the knock against Ulysses S. Grant is, here's this guy who was pushing for this thing that ultimately was a giant failure and that he should have known was a giant failure. And then you fast forward to the 1960s, and there's this rethinking of Reconstruction where it's not destined to fail, that it's a failure of Northern Republican will. coupled with the intransigence of white people that dooms Reconstruction to failure. And in that narrative, the problem isn't that Grant went too far, it's that he didn't go far enough. That if he had pushed farther and more consistently for African Americans' rights, that Reconstruction could have succeeded. And in fact, this 1960s, 1970s narrative can point to instances where Grant very judiciously uses federal power to root out reactionary elements. I mean, the Grant administration basically creates the Department of Justice and destroys the Ku Klux Klan, demonstrating that will, when joined to the might of the federal government, can affect broad scale social and political change. But whichever version you choose, Grant's the bad guy, either for pushing too hard or pushing not far enough. And it really hinges on the vision that you have of Reconstruction. And I think that for lefties, for reactionaries, they can both point to interpretations of Reconstruction where Grant is the bad guy. And there's really no space for rehabilitating Grant's image until we get again to the 1990s, where his presidential papers become more readily available, and suddenly you can see his perspective and you can see him weighing these things, and you can see him sort of struggling for the way to balance the various legislative priorities of his administration. It's not just Reconstruction, it's also about a contractionary monetary policy. It's also about an expansionist foreign policy. It's also about an effort to improve relationships with Native Americans. And some of these policy goals are mutually exclusive. And so Grant has to, by the nature of life, make choices. And the choices that he makes, I think, are very easy to caricature. But until the 1990s, I think it's very difficult to, again, get to his papers and see him weighing these options and sort of give him credit for at least understanding the choices that he's making and why he's doing the things that he's doing. And that's not to say that he's beyond reproach. He isn't. And I hope my book isn't hagiographic in any way. I think that I take him to task for what I consider to be poor choices on his part. But his legacy is bound up in our memory of Reconstruction. And I don't think as a culture we're ready to have an honest discussion about the ways in which white America, North and South, failed African Americans during Reconstruction.
I would back that point up with something I've said before, and I always preface it by saying it may sound like heresy on a history show, but it's that Ken Burns documentary. He shows those moments. He tells that sweeping story of the nation coming together again, of all these lovely high-minded things. For instance, William McKinley says that Americans have never surrendered except to other Americans, and he sends everybody off to Cuba when in the Spanish-American War, and he puts a Confederate General Wheeler in charge of the Expeditionary Force. Very wise political moves, but a narrative today to look back at and say, well, okay, that made sense to be doing that. But the reality on the ground was for Ken Burns to tell that story of those Union and Confederate veterans, these old men hugging, such a beautiful image. But to tell that story, you have to leave the freedmen out of it. You have to leave the African Americans who are stuck in a system where even the term African Americans doesn't apply fully to them because they're not fully allowed to be Americans. They're not fully allowed to exercise the franchise and live their lives as free people. The word freeman becomes a lie to them, a mirage, mocking the idea that they are free and that they are equal and all the things that Lincoln had promised but didn't live to at least try to deliver. Who can not like a picture of some old men hugging? We love to look at that, right?
Sure.
We love even in our time, John McCain goes back and he meets the jailer that kept him imprisoned in the POW camp, and we say, gosh, that makes us feel good. I want to be a better person. And that's fine. But at the time, those same people were not acting with that spirit of camaraderie. And for us to look back at them and just try to remember it as there's a lot of mint juleps and black and white photos, it isn't fair to that history. So I find that a fascinating thing. And I love that the presidency of Ulysses S. Grant is maybe able to start us on that road where we can look at it and have that perspective of what was really going on at the time and how our forefathers succeeded in winning the war, but they failed to really execute that vision. They were as flawed as we are, but maybe we can learn from it and do what's right today and finish the work they started.
Oh, absolutely. And I always shock people when I talk about this book at Civil War roundtables. I say to them, we've had several black senators in U.S. history. The first two were elected during Reconstruction, the third was elected in 1967. So history doesn't move in one direction for African Americans. There's this heady moment where it looks like everything's going to be possible. And then with the end of Reconstruction and the reassertion of this sort of reactionary Southern white dominance, things go very, very wrong for a very long time. And it is easy to think that the war ends at Appomattox, but it doesn't. If war is politics by other means, Reconstruction is debating the questions by the war by other means. The end of the war, the end of the shooting, doesn't necessarily bring an end to the war, quote unquote, if we think of the war as being caused by these political issues. And I think it's a very comforting myth to think that the country is knit back together. But as you say, you can only accept that if you exclude people who are not white from that narrative. And I think increasingly scholars are thinking that way. And I think it's hard to convince the general public of that. And part of the fight that we're having about these Confederate monuments is, I think, an attempt to have that discussion and recognize the degree to which the country was not willing to do what was necessary to face those issues then and remains somewhat unwilling even today.
That's something very cool about that Grant statue going up, because there's so much about Robert E. Lee at West Point. And Grant is just the guy basically who showed up to sign the papers. If you listen to some people, he didn't do anything right. It was just what Lee did wrong. I have a friend, and that always drives him nuts, that nobody talks about what Grant did right as a general, how he applied his experience in the Mexican War the same way Lee did, how he executed plans in a way that nobody else could. We mentioned Grant's drinking, and that's one of the great lines about Grant, where they come to Lincoln and they start whispering in his ear and backbiting Grant and saying, well, the guy drinks. And Lincoln says, can you order a barrel of whatever he drinks and send it to all my other generals? I can't spare this man. He fights. All that kind of stuff has gotten into our minds, where Lee's the guy who was the lost cause. He tried so hard. He was so valiant. Well, where's the guy who was right and an American from the beginning?
Right.
As you said, people had a lot of time to sit around and write about the past and get this myth of the lost cause going. But we should be able to have moved long beyond that, at least now that we have Grant's papers. But by 150 years, it's time to re-examine it. And we can understand in some ways people being tired of war and occupying the South. It makes sense that, especially back then, there was no FaceTime. They wanted their boys to come home. Okay, but we should be honest about it and what the legacy was and who paid the price for people that got tired and decided they didn't want to fight Reconstruction anymore.
Oh, absolutely. And it's interesting. Of course, Grant, from the moment that he takes office, is being slowly denuded of the resources to aggressively prosecute Reconstruction. So it's not just a matter of his preferences and his goals or even his administration's. Congress is slashing appropriations to the military. It's demobilizing the Army, which is the primary tool by which Reconstruction policy is implemented. And the Grant administration, as well as prominent Republican members of the Republican Party, are committed to a contractionary monetary policy. So there's actually less money in circulation, and much of the Treasury's gold is going to buy back greenbacks issued during the war. You add all of these things up, and what you're ending up with is fewer and fewer resources being made available for the administration to prosecute an aggressive Reconstruction policy. Again, it's contradictory policy imperatives. Are you willing to essentially occupy a foreign country for the decades necessary to achieve the thoroughgoing political, economic, social, cultural transformation that Reconstruction entails? And I don't think that there was anyone who, if they were being honest at the time, was willing to make that commitment, particularly after Southerners turned to terrorism. And I think there's no better word for it, to oppose the federal presence and federal efforts to protect African American rights. It's a complicated and bloody, bloody history that we don't teach in our schools, because to teach that is very difficult. It's about presenting something where there are no clear good guys and bad guys, because even the quote unquote good guys, these Northern Republicans, have a lot of very unappealing characteristics about them. They're spoilsmen, they're robber barons, they're feeding at the trough of public expenses. They are not attractive people to present a morality tale with. But nevertheless, for a variety of reasons, some of them less noble than others, they are, for a time, the leading proponents of protecting the rights of African Americans. And I think it's a complicated history, but it's a history that we would do well to acquaint ourselves and the general public with.
There's something else in the presidency of Ulysses S. Grant. We've talked a lot about looking inward, but Grant has a foreign policy legacy and a vision for foreign policy that may surprise listeners. And when they pick up the book, they may say, what's today the Dominican Republic, possibly being a state. Also, there's relationships with the UK, relationships with Russia, which is then a closer ally of the United States than the British are at the time. We fought the War of 1812 not so long ago. As you mentioned, your next book, James Buchanan, he suited up for that, didn't actually see combat, didn't do much, marched around a lot, but that was about it. We're rivals at that point. What do you think about his foreign policy as far as what readers will learn about it and how it would have looked different if he had succeeded more with things like adding the Dominican Republic?
Yeah, the Grant administration, probably foreign policy is the great unheralded triumph of the Grant administration. And in fact, if you look at, I guess about 35 or 40 years ago, American Heritage ranked the top 5 or 10 secretaries of state in U.S. history up to that point. And Grant's Secretary of State, Hamilton Fish, who was with Grant for nearly his entire administration, ranked incredibly high, even while the presidency that he served in was one of the worst, generally speaking, according to historians. So this is a really interesting disjuncture between Hamilton Fish's historical reputation and Grant's, even though in large part he's exercising Grant's foreign policy. He's Grant's closest advisor, and they're working probably closer than any other cabinet member and president in Grant's administration to do these policies. And Grant's signature policy, again, ironically enough, is an attempt to annex Santo Domingo, today's Dominican Republic, which he never achieves. And here Grant is following in a long line of presidents. He's engaging in what I call magical thinking about the issue of first slavery and then race. And, magical thinking about the problem of slavery, the problem of race relations in the United States goes back to the founding fathers. These guys kick the can down the road and just assume, slavery will end naturally, or succeeding generations will find a way to deal with the problem that are just beyond us, and we're just, we haven't figured out yet. And throughout the 19th century, as it became clear that slavery was a problem that wasn't going away, you get people coming up with these seemingly really easy fixes, these attempts to find a way within the political system to deal with this fundamentally moral issue. And so, you have the Missouri Compromise. We'll draw a line, and above the line you'll be a free state, and below the line you'll be a slave state. And that seems like a really good fix-all. But then, of course, you're confronted with the issue of California, part of which is above the Missouri Compromise, part of which is below the Missouri Compromise line. And so the plan that we come up with is, we'll let the voters of each territory decide. That's a good democratic solution. And that, of course, leads to the violence in Kansas and Nebraska. And so, then it's like, let's let the Supreme Court take a whack at it. And, of course, the infamous Dred Scott decision, in trying to answer this question once and for all, ends up inflaming the issue and making it worse. And I think that Grant, like every president, is trying to find the easy fix. And so for him, the easy fix is, okay, we've got all these freed African Americans. We've got a whole bunch of racist whites, both in the North and the South, who have made it clear that they're only going to grudgingly accept African Americans as free men, and they're not going to concede anything in terms of political rights. What are we going to do? I know what we'll do is we'll buy Santo Domingo and we'll send all the black people there. And then we won't have any racial problems because there just won't be any black people. And it's insane when you think about it. But Grant was not idiosyncratic in thinking this. One of the primary boosters of this plan during Grant's presidency was Frederick Douglass, who recognized, I think, that race relations were going to be strained going to be terrible, quite frankly, due to white intransigence for at least his lifetime, and that the only way to get away from, again, the terrorism of white Southerners was to leave. And where are they going to go? White Northerners aren't too hip to the idea of African Americans moving north, as we see in the 20th century. So where do you go? Well, you buy an island and you go there. It strikes us as this really harebrained and insane scheme, but I think you have to look at it in the context of a recognition that there's a long tradition of looking for the easy fix to this, and a sort of corollary recognition that there is no easy fix to this, that short of aggressive and sustained federal action that is going to be time consuming and expensive, what you're going to have is racial strife. And that racial strife is going to be almost completely one-sided unless you are willing to force white Americans to respect African Americans' rights. What you are going to have is 150 years of white on black terrorism, which, shocker of shocker, is what we have.
It's also an idea that Lincoln had, Liberia, if people want to check their map of Africa and you wonder how an African country ended up with a capital named after James Monroe. So it's not as if this is just Grant's idea. And as you said,
no.
it sounds harebrained to us today, maybe. And it sounds like, well, and it makes me think of Grant. He kind of got the hang of this whole being a politician thing by this idea because, yeah, sure, just propose something with no idea of the unintended consequences or the actual human costs, not to mention logistics of it, to just start ripping people up who have no connection to a place and sticking them there, which is not something they certainly as a people needed to go through again. They didn't want to leave. And so this was an idea he had. The idea with Britain was that we would have better relationships with them, and that does bear much better fruit. Well, bears actual fruit, since the Dominican Republic today is an independent country, not a state. But that lays the groundwork here for the special relationship that we take for granted today. And that's something I think people will find surprising too.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that, in light of sort of the general awareness of World War II generally, and specifically the close relationship between FDR and Churchill, it's kind of shocking the degree to which American relations with Great Britain were actually pretty awful throughout, the first 3/4 of the 19th century. The Brits had burned the capital of the United States, which Americans remembered vividly. During the war, British shipbuilders had built ships that they then covertly sold to the Confederacy, which caused millions upon millions of dollars in damage to not only federal government ships, but also private ships and private installations. So there was a great deal of anger, all these small level conflicts. At one point, the British were recruiting soldiers in the American South. And while Buchanan was minister to Great Britain, he sort of got into an argument with the Brits about that. There were fights about the boundary of Oregon. It was kind of a giant mess, and relations were not pleasant. And the Treaty of Washington, which was ratified in 1871, changes the tone of US-British relations. And it goes from being this very fraught, if not quite on the verge of war, then certainly war is not impossible or unthinkable, to the special relationship where the United States today, the idea that we would go to war against Great Britain is almost unthinkable today. But during Grant's lifetime, certainly people expected to go to war. In fact, there were people in Congress, most notably Charles Sumner, who were calling for the Grant administration to go to war against Great Britain if the British didn't settle the claims arising from the damage caused by the ships they had provided the Confederacy. So it wasn't a fringe idea that the United States and Great Britain were fated to be enemies. And through the groundwork laid by Hamilton Fish, with oversight by Grant, the Grant administration sets in motion a change in relations so that 70 years later, the United States and Great Britain are the closest of allies in confronting Nazi Germany. That's an incredibly important and I would say somewhat overlooked element of Grant's administration that speaks to his successes. This wasn't the Three Stooges constantly walking into doors and hitting each other. There were notable successes in the Grant administration, and this is one of them.
A name that's synonymous with corruption.
Yeah.
And so that's another one of these things, and you learn that here. Grand Army of the Republic, not synonymous with that, which is another thing that's not necessarily exactly accurate, as we talked about in war stuff, which I mentioned earlier. But he's not this cookie cutter. And I think when you look at history, it's so easy just to say, okay, this guy was terrible, let's move on, because there's so much history that's out there, so many people. And that's why I resist those lists that say who's the good president, who's the bad. You should read the book and try to figure it out yourself about whoever the person is. Don't take any of those lists at face value. That's just one part of it, and that's just one part of Grant. And in fact, you write, because there are so many books about Grant, quote, with our recent outpouring of books about Ulysses S. Grant, you are forgiven if you wonder whether we really need another one, unquote. And I wanted to make sure that I get that in here as we come to the twilight of our chat, because I think a little bit of Grant's self-deprecating humor rubbed off on you there, because certainly we did need this book. This fits a definite niche. It's an important one. So give readers your pitch. Why did you write, and why do you think they should read this book? You pitched it already convincingly to a publisher, obviously. So what do you think? Why should they pick up The Presidency of Ulysses S. Grant?
Because Reconstruction is a wildly overlooked moment in American history, but the challenges raised by the war have been far more enduring than I think people thought at the time, and certainly that they should have. They could have been solved, and Grant made an honest effort to try and solve them. Some of the schemes were harebrained and wrong-headed, but a lot of them created an infrastructure that over time provided the basis for improving rights and protections, not only for African Americans, but for Native Americans, for women, for Asian Americans, etc. And I think that the impulse to shy away from the messy is one of the reasons why we continue to face the challenges and unresolved issues as a culture that we do. And I hope that this book is the beginning of a conversation about grappling with that very complicated legacy, and about the structure of political power in the 19th century and the ways in which policy was formulated and implemented and sometimes defeated.
Well, Dr. Paul Kahan, I certainly enjoyed our conversation about the book. Look how much it's gotten us talking already. And I hope that people will pick it up. I hope they'll read The Presidency of Ulysses S. Grant. And maybe if they're near one of those statues I mentioned, either in Washington, D.C. or that new one at West Point, they'll have an intelligent retort for people who have a misconception of our 18th president. I want to thank you for joining me. I so much enjoy our chats. I'm really glad we have another one. I'm really also looking forward to this one you're going to write on James Buchanan. And yes, it's not a mistake. If you are watching the Avengers movie right now, James Bucky Barnes, right? He's James Buchanan Barnes. And James Buchanan's friends would have called him Buck. In fact, that was his nickname, was Buck Cannon.
That's right.
So here I am already starting on that, right?
Well, I hope to come back when it's finished.
I really enjoyed it. Thank you so much for joining me. The words "let us have peace" still resonate today, still something we search for. Thanks not just to you, and best of luck not only to you, but I noticed in your acknowledgments that you thanked your mother for being kind enough to babysit for you while you wrote the book. So I wanted to give your mother a shout out too and say thank you to her on behalf of everybody like myself who enjoyed the fact that you did write this book.
Well, thank you. I will certainly pass along your warm wishes.
Again, the book is The Presidency of Ulysses S. Grant, Preserving the Civil War's Legacy. As always, you can find the Amazon link to purchase your copy at historyauthor.com. And we hope you will click through there, or even navigate via the Amazon banner at the top of our homepage the next time you purchase anything from Amazon. Let's say you want to buy some hardtack. Well, you go to historyauthor.com, that banner takes you through to Amazon, and Amazon.com gives us a small portion of every dollar or stonewall you spend at no additional charge in your shopping cart. For just those few extra clicks, you can help us keep the flux capacitor on our time machine humming like usual. Once again, my thanks to Dr. Paul Kahan for coming back on the show and for giving us a clearer, more honest view of the 8 years that U.S. Grant bound up the nation's wounds after the Civil War, and President Andrew Johnson's impeachment. If you're hungry for more from Paul, visit our archives for our previous chats about Paul's books, Amiable Scoundrel, Simon Cameron, Lincoln's Scandalous Secretary of War, and The Bank War, Andrew Jackson, Nicholas Biddle, and the Fight for American Finance. You can also find our guest on Twitter at Paul_Kahan, or visit his website, paulkahan.com. That last name is spelled Kahan. And remember, let us know what you think of the book and the interview on Twitter at HistoryDean, our Instagram page, or facebook.com/historyauthor. That's it for this installment of the History Author Show. I hope you'll join us for our next all-new interview right here on iHeartRadio or wherever you're listening. And remember, if you subscribe to us on iTunes, please take a minute to leave us a review. Well, until our next trip into the past together, thanks so much for time traveling with us today, and have a great week.
We still call it Broadway, but what's in a name? Take it from Georgie, it isn't the same. On the east side, west side, things ain't like before. There are tears in the eyes of the regular guys. Oh, New York ain't New York anymore.